Testing. Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to analyze the impact of President Biden's April 14th, 2021 go-to-zero U.S. military withdrawal order in Afghanistan and the effect that this had on the Afghan military and Air Force in the middle of the Afghan fighting season. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. As mentioned, we're going to examine the go-to-zero order. Now, in the past 27 months, the disastrous images of embassy personnel being airlifted off the roof in Kabul, the images of desperate parents throwing their babies over walls of HKIA, the images of Afghans clinging to the wings of transport planes. They've been played on loops across media across the world. The purpose of today's hearing is twofold. It's not to just rehash those horrifying images. It's to pinpoint the day where it all went wrong, where you could say there's a day before and a day after, the day that President Joe Biden announced the go-to-zero order. And it's not just to provide an after-action report. It's to force President Biden to do something that it seems he hasn't been willing to do since the day he was sworn into office, and that's to live in reality, the reality of the circumstances that are going on around you. President Biden loves to say that the collapse of Kabul in August of 21 was inevitable, but anybody who was paying an ounce of attention can tell you that it wasn't inevitable. The collapse of Kabul wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2002. It wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2010 when I was airlifted off the battlefield of Kandahar. It wasn't something that we were headed towards in 2016 when Donald J. Trump was elected. It wasn't something that we were headed towards on February 29, 2020, when the Doha Agreement was signed. It wasn't something that we were headed towards on January 20, 2021, when Joe Biden took office. It became inevitable on April 14, 2021, when Joe Biden publicly announced his plans for an unconditional withdrawal by September 11, 2021. President Biden loves to place the blame on the Doha Agreement and President Trump's negotiations. But in doing so, I believe that he is ignoring reality. Let's be clear, the Doha Agreement told President Biden what he had to do. But President Biden did not have to publicly announce any plans for a specific withdrawal date. Didn't have to be a hard and fast date that he announced to the world, a self-imposed deadline. President Biden did not have to redirect resources from fighting terrorists in all capacities to drawing down all operations at the height of the fighting season, as opposed to the winter months. President Biden did not have to knock the knees out from the Afghan military by cutting and gutting their air support, withdrawing key contractors, and pulling logistic capabilities. President Biden did not have to abandon Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night without so much as a Dear John letter to our Afghan partners. President Biden did not have to ignore the fact that the Taliban was in violation of every single condition that was set forward by the Doha Agreement. All of those decisions were made by a commander-in-chief who was determined to, in my opinion, avoid reality, and whose only North Star was a political future, a political star. Our witnesses today will be able to speak to the reality that President Biden so obviously avoided. Mr. Roggio saw the writing on the wall as he tracked the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan in real time. General Sami Sadat was forced to live with the consequences of Biden's delusion as his troops were left demoralized and without resources needed to defend their nation, a nation that myself and my colleague both spent a good amount of time in. I also want to thank Dr. Dipali Mukhopadhyay. I've worked on saying that a couple times and I still mess it up, and I apologize. I'm going to have to say it a few more times. For being here today, to lend your expertise and your opinion, and to recognize the members of the Afghan Army's National Female Tactical Platoon who are in attendance today. In addition, I want to recognize the fact that Ms. Christy Shamlin, mother-in-law of Sergeant Nicole G., is here today. It's always nice to see you and appreciate you continually paying attention to this issue, taking of your time to continually do so. One of the 13 killed at the Abbey Gate. Here's why all of this matters. Let me wrap this up. The refusal to operate in reality that gave more than 13 families the title of Gold Star on August 26, 2021. It's the same delusion that has underestimated terrorists and led to 48 attacks against our U.S. military posts in the past month, not living in reality of what's taking place. Same delusion that allowed him to say that there's a safe and secure border, or that inflation is just a brief transient inflation. It's not a recognition of reality in foreign and domestic. Every minute that President Biden ignores the reality is another minute that our troops across the globe are put at unnecessary risk, and another minute that the network of terrorists from Taliban to Hamas are able to get closer to their goals of destroying the United States of America. I now recognize my friend, ranking member, gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, for any statement at any length that you may have.
Thank you, Chairman Mast, for calling this really important hearing. I would like to begin by recognizing Ms. Shamblin for being here and for the sacrifice that your family has made for our country on behalf of all of us, a sacrifice of which we owe a great debt that our nation will never be able to repay, but we will certainly try to do that sacrifice credit here and moving forward. And I also want to recognize the members of the Afghan military, my Afghan brothers and sisters who fought this war with great courage, with great fortitude, and both of us leave pieces of our heart in Afghanistan and with you and your families, and thank you for being here today as well. The purpose here, though, is to have a debate about a very challenging period in our nation's history. The chairman talked about pinpointing the day it all went wrong. Our service members and the American people do deserve that. They deserve an honest assessment of that. They deserve honesty and they deserve candor. And I, for my part, have been very clear about my criticisms of the withdrawal. And I continue to be clear about that. But telling the story of Afghanistan, our nation's longest war, 20 years, hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of lives, just American lives, but also tens of thousands or more Afghan lives, requires a broader look. It would be doing a great credit and disservice to talk about this simply as the story of August of 2021. Because the day it all went wrong includes many days over many, many years. So I'd like to outline a chronology, a timeline that's extremely important here today. As you can see, starting on February 29th of 2020, there were 13,000 American service members in Afghanistan at the time that former President Trump signed the Doha Accord. By May 19th of 2020, there were 8,600 service members in Afghanistan. By September 3rd of 2020, Afghanistan was compelled to release 400 Taliban prisoners required under the agreement. Then by November 17th of 2020, we were down to 2,500 forces, or we announced a withdrawal of 2,500 forces by January of 21, before President Trump took off, or President Biden took office. Between December 1st and December 31st of 2020, There were 185 pro-government forces killed, over 3,000 security forces killed, and over 1,400 civilians killed by the Taliban during that period, far from compliance with the Doha Agreement. Then by January 15th, before President Biden took office, we had completed the withdrawal down to 2,500 forces. So the cement was hardening on the events of August 2021 way before it occurred. Highlighting a few key events. Again, it was February 29th of 2020 where Donald Trump signed the Doha Accord with the Taliban. Then you go to September 12th of 2020. The Afghan-Taliban talks finally start, 7 months behind schedule. Then going to October 7th of 2020, Donald Trump started tweeting, and he said specifically that American troops would be home by Christmas. At the same time, they were trying to compel the Taliban to adhere to the deal and maintain security. The President of the United States is tweeting out that we're going to do an immediate withdrawal of troops, undermining everything that we had done way before 2021. So by January 15th of 21, the Afghan first vice president says that Trump made too many concessions to the Taliban and that violence will only increase. So yes, were there mistakes and missteps in August of 21? Undoubtedly there were. And we will do after action reviews, we'll have discussions to make sure that we can never repeat those mistakes again because we deserve to do better. Those who made the sacrifice that month deserve us to do better. But make no mistake, this is not the story of August 2021. And it would be doing a great disservice to the American people and all who made tremendous sacrifices if we did not recognize the many missteps that were made over 4 presidential administrations, Republican and Democrat, that were made over 10 Congresses, Republican and Democrat. Too many people sacrificed too much to look at this as a narrow story. President Biden, when he took office in January 2021, with the lowest number of troops that we had in decades, faced a simple choice. Do we abide by the Doha Agreement that was negotiated under the prior administration? Or do we go back to war with the Taliban, in which case we would have to surge a tremendous number of forces to protect the Americans who were still there, and we would be fighting to this day. That was the choice. Now you can disagree one way or the other on what that choice should have been, but that was the choice he was facing. There was no status quo. That was the terrible choice, and he made the decision to withdraw and pull out and to comply with the agreement. So with that history in mind, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and having a discussion that befits the sacrifice of so many folks over the last 20 years. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic. To start, again, we have General Sami Sadat, who was final commanding general of the Afghan National Army's Special Operations Corps and commanded the Afghan Army's 215th Maiwan Corps into August 2021. No one is better positioned to speak to the immediate and devastating impact of President Biden's go-to-zero order on the Afghan military's fight against the Taliban. Next, we have Mr. Bill Roggio, who is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense Democracies and a longtime editor of FDD's Long War Journal, where he has provided critical insight and analysis into the global war on terror and the war in Afghanistan. Finally, again, we have Dr. Mukhopadhyay, who is Associate Professor of Global Policy at University of Minnesota. She joined the university with tenure in 2020. She was previously a member of the junior faculty at Columbia University. Thank you all for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask that you keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for member questions. I now recognize you, General Sadat, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Congressman Crow, and members of the committee, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us for this hearing today. Before answering questions, I want to take a few minutes to make some remarks, and my remarks are divided in three parts in what is happening in Afghanistan under the Taliban now. Number two, why we got here, and number three, what are the possible solutions that I can recommend to the committee. For the past 20 years, the American people helped support and protect the people of Afghanistan, our people. We built a new society with your support where for first time girls were educated across the country and women were treated with equality. A new generation grew up with the hope that this time it would be different and Afghanistan would take its rightful place among the family of free democratic nations. Unfortunately, it was not to last. That hope was cruelly extinguished. But we remember how, in the hard times when President Biden and President Ghani turned their tail and run away, it was you, members of Congress, who supported the efforts of your brave service members, men and women, who saved thousands of Afghan lives in the face of certain death as our country collapsed. On behalf of the people of Afghanistan, I thank you. We will remember this for the rest of our days. 20 years after 9/11, Afghanistan fell back into the hands of the terrorists who were the very reason why 9/11 has happened. The consequences for the region and the world are grave. As we can see in the recent unfortunate events in the Middle East, the rise of Taliban has given new life to the groups like Hamas. Today, some 16,000 al-Qaeda terrorists are training in our country. Their leaders move freely between Afghanistan and Iran along a safe terror corridor. The former American base close to Kandahar Airport is now full of foreign fighters training as suicide bombers. They are so embedded into the Taliban system that the Taliban Ministry of Defense is using Al-Qaeda manual for its training. And it's not just Al-Qaeda. In our country today, we have the TTP from Pakistani Taliban, we have Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, we have Ansarullah of Tajikistan, and etc., etc. With the Taliban in power, terrorism has now time, space, and inspiration that were denied by the US military and the Afghan military. The Taliban have opened some 2,000 jihadi madrasas, housing 800,000 boys aged between 12 to 15. Their purpose is to train for global jihad. Why is this important? The Taliban are Sunni Muslims who follow a distorted interpretation of the Holy Quran, tailored to serve their authority. They divide the world into two zones. The first zone, Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam, or the land of the peace. The second is Dar al-Harb, as known as Dar al-Kufr as well, the land of war or the land of the infidels. In their interpretation, the only place governed by Islam is Afghanistan. The rest of the world is a place to wage war, to expand their distorted version of Islam. They started this campaign from our neighbor in Pakistan, who nurtured them for so many years with no mercy on children, women, and non-combatants. The next place to wage war is the Middle East. They believe no Arab country is governed under pure Islam. Hence, they want to help Al-Qaeda topple Arab governments. For them to wage war, killing men and women, seizing property, and toppling businesses is an act of jihad, to please God and die for the cause that will be rewarded in the afterlife. And they have allied with Iran, opening a corridor of terror from Afghanistan to Iraq, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East with the help of the Iranian IRGC. China, also our neighbor, is paying the Taliban large sums of money for access to Afghan mines and routes for Iranian oil via Afghanistan, blocking any access of the United States and allies in that region. How did we get here? In 2020 and 2021, as predicted, the Taliban ignored their side of the Doha deal. They didn't cut their links with Al-Qaeda and continue to conduct large-scale attacks on Afghan cities. To give you an example of their brutal attacks, in the 11 months of 2020 after the deal, the Taliban conducted 48,600 attacks, including car bombs, assassinations, and large-scale assaults on Afghan cities. I'm running out of my time, Mr. Chairman. I will answer the rest of them in the Q&A. If you want to give me some time, I'll continue for another minute.
I can give you another minute. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
By all means.
In return, we were told to halt all military operations to give peace a chance. Our ammunition supply was halted, and 17,000 contractors who maintained our aircraft and software system had the orders to leave Afghanistan. Further, the Afghan government was told to release 7,000 Taliban prisoners, including men who killed American and NATO troops, drug dealers, and baby killers. We still stood our ground with whatever we could and kept fighting. But Secretary of State Mr. Antony Blinken wrote a letter to President Ghani in which it was made public, asking the president to resign and that allow a Taliban-led to allow the Taliban-led government to come to power. This made it very clear to everybody in Afghanistan and in our region that the Afghan government no longer has the support and trust of the United States, hence giving a chance for Iran and Pakistan to come up with everything they have in support of the Taliban and lead into the collapse of our country. But despite the failure on the part of the Taliban to stick to the terms of the deal, President Biden still went ahead with the withdrawal, leading to the chaos of collapse of our country. It was a betrayal not only of the Afghan hopes, but of the sacrifice of over 200,000 Afghan troops and 6,000 Americans who died for our freedom. And some of them carry injuries, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, until this day. I know what loss means. Some of those brave warriors fell or were wounded when on an operation with me. To this day, I remember every moment and feel the pain in my bones. And I say to you now that I would be betraying the sacrifice if I didn't attempt to recover our land, where Afghans and Americans bled for freedom. It would be an insult to their sacrifice to allow the widows and children to be ruled by the brute, dehumanized Taliban. Mr. Chairman, I know we cannot go back in the past to change what has happened, but we can change the future and what is to come to us. We're not going to sit idle and let it happen. We're organizing now to recover our country, united under one flag with equal rights for women, inclusive of all minorities, and governed under a constitution chosen by our people. We have set up a political movement, Afghanistan United Front, to show our resolve in wanting a legitimate government in Afghanistan. We're not asking American boots on the ground alongside us. We're asking for your moral and political support. In our history, like other nations, we have seen tough times and invasions, but we always came back together and saved our country. We will fight for freedom and to free our country again, making the Taliban rule a brief interruption in our history. We are ready for the great sacrifice. We will once again be one free nation under God. Thank you.
Thank you, General Sadat. I now recognize Mr. Roggio for your opening statement.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, and other members of the Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and thank you, General Sadat, and our other members of the panel here for taking the time today. There are many reasons that our mission in Afghanistan was troubled. There can be no denying that one decision, President Biden's April 14, 2021 order to withdraw from Afghanistan, is directly responsible for the collapse of the Afghan government and its security forces. And that was what we have been brought here today to discuss. Certainly, prior administrations contributed to the poor state of Afghanistan. The Afghan government and military created by President Bush was ill-suited to combat an insurgency. President Obama's strategy was muddled, its surge was under-resourced and executed on an unrealistic timeline. And the administration opened negotiations with the Taliban. And President Trump's deal with the Taliban, known as the Doha Agreement, was an absolute disaster. But this is extremely important. Despite the mistakes of previous administrations, on April 13th, 2021, the government of Afghanistan was still standing, and the Afghan military and police were still fighting the Taliban. Despite statements from the Biden administration that it was cornered to execute the terms of the Doha Agreement, the administration was not obligated to do so. The Taliban was not living up to the terms of the deal as it continued to shelter and support al-Qaeda and other groups. The Biden administration knew this, and yet it followed through on the Doha Agreement anyway. The fact is that President Biden was determined to leave Afghanistan. The Doha Agreement was a convenient excuse to do so. President Biden's order to withdraw had an immediate and devastating effect on the Afghan government and military. Once the order was given, U.S. forces were no longer supporting their Afghan partners. Instead, the immediate focus was on packing up and leaving. We all remember the U.S. military turning off power at Bagram Air Base and leaving in the middle of the night without informing our Afghan partners. For another powerful example of this, I strongly suggest watching Retrograde, which documents the impact of the withdrawal on General Sadat's command. You will see that U.S. Special Forces, which supported the General Sadat's corps, immediately ceased operations. Despite difficulties in the South, this team of Special Forces was crucial in supporting the Afghan military operations and holding the Taliban at bay. Without U.S. support, the Afghan military couldn't sustain its operations. We built an Afghan military that was dependent on Western contractors for maintenance and logistics. Without this support, Afghan air assets, which were operating at a high tempo due to the Taliban onslaught, were quickly degraded. There are other factors which I've highlighted in my written testimony that I do hope we discuss today. General Sadat can no doubt speak authoritatively from his experience on the impact of President Biden's withdrawal order and it had on his soldiers and their morale. One thing is clear, the outcome, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, was predictable. U.S. government, military, and intelligence officials said that the Afghan government wouldn't be under threat for 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal. After the withdrawal was announced, I predicted that the Afghan government wouldn't make it by the end of the summer. Kabul fell on August 15th. Panjshir, the last holdout province, collapsed on September 7th. Taliban didn't take control of Afghanistan in 11 days. This was a process that began the day that the withdrawal was announced, and it was set up by years of failure. How did multi-billion-dollar government organizations get it so wrong? These are questions that you must ask. The mistakes of past administrations were either correctable or could have been mitigated over time. The order to withdraw was final, and once executed, irreversible. However, if the Biden administration was hell-bent on leaving, it could have executed a phased withdrawal that it could have given the Afghan military a fighting chance. Why wasn't a responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan planned and executed? The implications of the withdrawal fiasco, both the decision to leave and the abandonment of our ally of 20 years, and the physical implementation of the withdrawal have lasting effects. We left an ally which sacrificed hundreds of thousands of its security personnel and an untold number of civilians battling the Taliban alone to the predations of a terror group that sponsored al-Qaeda both before and after 9/11. Al-Qaeda remains ensconced in Afghanistan and today is operating at least 6 training camps, as well as safe houses and a media operations center. Several al-Qaeda leaders serve in the Taliban government. Sirajudin Haqqani, one of the 2 deputy emirs of the Taliban and its Minister of Interior. He is a specially designated global terrorist for his ties to al-Qaeda. So are an untold number of his deputies listed as specially designated global terrorists. The Haqqani network, which Sirajudin Haqqani runs, is listed as a foreign terrorist organization. Sirajudin Haqqani's Interior Ministry issues national ID cards and passports to al-Qaeda leaders, operatives, and their families. Let that one sink in. Beyond Afghanistan, the ramifications of the precipitous withdrawal are still being felt today. Jihadists across the globe have been emboldened by our defeat. Our allies question our commitments. Our adversaries and enemies do so as well. President Biden's order to leave Afghanistan has gravely impacted U.S. national security. We must accept these facts if we wish to avoid these mistakes in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Roggio. Now recognize Dr. Mukhopadhyay for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and for perfectly pronouncing my name. I appreciate that. Thank you to you. Thank you to members of the committee. Having spent my adult life as a scholar of Afghanistan, it is a privilege to be with you. I first traveled there in 2004 and made 11 extended trips thereafter, the last of which took place in the summer of 2021. I start by stating a fact on which I presume we can all agree. America's longest war was not lost in 20 days or 20 months, but rather over 20 years. 4 presidents made decisions that brought us here, and each one's policies constrained those who followed. Ultimately, and in many ways, the logic, design, and implementation of the war doomed the Afghan Republic. This contention does not suggest American malice, nor does it absolve Afghan guilt. But we must be clear. The United States and its allies went to war in the fall of 2001 because al-Qaeda attacked our homeland. The subsequent promotion of women's rights, democracy, and development mattered to the degree they advanced the war on terror. A friendly government in Kabul, not a sovereign Afghan state, was the goal. This truth helps us understand the back to the future moment in which we and the Afghan people find ourselves with the Taliban once again at the helm. A number of early choices taken by the United States and its allies crippled the new Afghan government before it even got started. The Taliban regime fell swiftly, and its successor owed its existence to the West. In exchange, it would not control many of the fundamental decisions about power and politics on the ground. The Americans prevented President Karzai from exploring any genuine possibility of peace with those Talibs who sought surrender, a choice that would haunt US governments years later when it aimed to negotiate with those same enemies on vastly worse terms. The United States emboldened Pakistan as a key partner in the war, even as the Pakistani security establishment gave sanctuary to those who killed American and Afghan forces for years to come. The coalition empowered anti-Taliban commanders as its core ground force early on and later as counterinsurgent militia forces. Even as some of those strongmen became valuable governing partners, others leveraged ongoing American support to their own ends, often at the expense of new civil and military institutions. The United States invested substantial aid in those institutions, but in erratic, incoherent, and unsustainable terms. The risks of such built-in dependencies were especially evident in the Afghan security sector. The triumph of foreign designs over Afghan self-determination was also exemplified in the international approach to elections. Foreign powers set an overly ambitious tempo and then selectively addressed fraud in terms that steadily undermined public trust and risked turning each electoral standoff into a civil war. By the time the 2019 election arrived in Afghanistan, the Trump administration made clear that the time for our involvement there was over. A quick deal with the Taliban was a priority, even if that meant sacrificing the country's future as a democracy. The ultimate precarity of Afghan sovereignty would be most vividly revealed in 2020 when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. A boon to the Taliban, this deal undercut any remaining leverage the Afghan government might have had in subsequent negotiations to sue for peace without entirely sacrificing Republican values. The Trump administration then unilaterally dropped troop levels to 4,500 and just days before President Biden's inauguration to 2,500. Meanwhile, the Afghan government was forced to release thousands of Taliban prisoners, a provision in a deal to which it had not been a party. I was in Kabul in March 2020, and the sense of collective despair was palpable. Deeply disillusioned with their own leaders, Afghans were also resentful that their experiment with free politics mattered little to the Americans as we beat a path to the exits. My last visit to Kabul in the summer of 2021 is one I will never forget. Afghan leaders were both disbelieving about and therefore unprepared for the impending American departure, and yet also so crippled by its possibility that dysfunction had arrested the entire state. More striking, however, was the courage of my many longtime interlocutors in civil society, who understood that all they built was now in jeopardy. They vowed not to give up, though nearly all were eventually forced to leave in the face of near certain persecution or death. The progress they secured gives me great optimism for Afghanistan's long-term future. But their sacrifices, as well as those of our own, demand our honest and deep reflection. We may not again engage in state building in the service of countering terrorism, but all of our interventions disrupt the politics and lives of others profoundly. We must learn from the Afghan war both the productive possibilities and acute limits of American power, and try then to wield it with greater humility and care. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you all for your comments. I'm sorry, I cannot agree with what you said. I will just start by saying I do define a win as the outcomes being better than what I expected, and a loss being the outcomes being worse than what I expected. So I can't agree with you, but we'll have time to discuss this and debate this as everybody will. I will now recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Crow, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to talk about the chronology leading up to the drawdown that I touched on in my opening remarks. You know, I served in Afghanistan multiple times. I served in Iraq. I've been in combat environments, and we know that the morale of forces is essential. The will to fight is the most powerful thing, right? More powerful than any weapon system, any strategy, any tactic. The will to fight, and morale is essential to that. So, at a moment where we're trying to enhance morale, when we're trying to embolden our partners, there were a series of just deeply troubling statements and comments coming out of the former president's White House and from the former president himself. And I just would like to start with you, General Sadat, on a few of these. Here you have President Trump tweeting out on October 7th of 2020, "We should have the small remaining number of our brave men and women serving in Afghanistan home by Christmas." Do you remember when that tweet went out?
I don't, but I was aware that he was trying to draw down troops to a minimum level.
What was the impact of this statement and your awareness and your force's awareness when these statements were being made?
Of course, statements made in Washington had a real impact, especially on us in the battleground, and these remarks have had its impact. But we continue to communicate with U.S. military, and we were told there was a backup plan, that if things go south, the U.S. military will get involved. And they were actually gearing up and preparing for that, because both us and the U.S. military, like you served there, we knew that this deal would not stand, and we will get back on it.
Did you ever see this backup plan or get specifics of it?
I was a part of a trip in, I believe it was in February of 2021 in Garmsir district, where General Miller and myself visited a Navy SEALs camp in Garmsir, and there I saw that there was a plan that the SEALs told us that if the orders were given when the deal goes off completely, they can destroy the Taliban in southern Afghanistan in 9 days. So for me, that sounded like a quite reassuring backup plan.
General, on November 11th, 2020, the former president wrote a memo, and in the memo he said, "I hereby direct you to withdraw all U.S. military forces from the Federal Republic of Somalia no later than 31 December 2020, and from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan no later than 15 January 2021. Were you familiar with that memo when it was signed, as it went public?
No, sir, I don't recall. And I apologize for not recalling all of this. I was a combat soldier, and I was always busy fighting. But these things had its impact for sure.
Can you comment on the morale of your forces in 2020?
The morale of the forces went very bad when the Doha deal has happened. It was so dramatic, not only our forces politically, also giving the region the sense that the United States is leaving, a deterrence posture was lost. Politically, we could never recover, Congressman Crow, from what happened in Doha. We were seen as a government that is not respected by its own allies.
Mr. Roggio, gather we disagree about the impact of the withdrawal from your opening statements. But I do want to just try to flesh out what I believe is a fact, and that is, if we had not abided by the timeline, and I know we actually extended the timeline of the withdrawal of the Doha Agreement, but if we had not abided by the extended timeline of the withdrawal, it was pretty clear from the evidence we've gathered in transcribed interviews and prior hearings that the Taliban would have resumed offensive operations against the United States military in earnest. And at that point, we had 2,500 troops, the lowest amount we had had in almost 20, actually over 20 years. How many troops would the United States had to have surged into Afghanistan if we had not abided by the withdrawal timeline?
I can't speak to the number. I think one of my problems with our policy in Afghanistan has always been a discussion of the number of troops and not the quality of troops that we put in there. We could have put 100,000 cooks in Afghanistan, and it may not have made a difference. But if we'd have put in 5,000 combat forces, probably would have made a significant difference. Sir, you referenced Somalia. President Biden put U.S. troops back into Somalia after President Trump withdrew them. Why did he do so? Because he feared the collapse of the Somali government. Why was Somalia and the collapse of the Somalia government more important than the collapse of our 20-year project in Afghanistan?
Well, Mr. Roggio, on the issue of troops, I agree that composition of a unit is important, but 5,000 combat troops without support, without logistics, obviously does not matter. So would you agree, though, that 2,500 troops on the ground would not have been sufficient, that we would have had to have increased our footprint in Afghanistan?
I do agree that we would have had to have increased our footprint. What that number is, I can't tell you, but again, the Afghan forces were fighting, and Afghanistan did not collapse on August 13th. So the question was Afghanistan important enough to the Biden administration to maintain a U.S. commitment in Afghanistan? If the answer was yes, then he would have had to have put a number of troops back in. And if the answer was no, then as he believed, he ordered a withdrawal. But the withdrawal, as I stated in my verbal testimony, was never conditioned to allow the Afghan government and military to succeed. They were not given a chance. So to answer your question, yes, we would have needed more combat troops in Afghanistan, but how the withdrawal was executed was entirely predictable, and we all witnessed the results of that.
Thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize Mr. Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the panel for everyone coming here and for your time of service. It's greatly appreciated. I want to comment on a few things, because every time that we try to get to the bottom of the final decision-making, which is always at the behest of the Commander-in-Chief, somehow we find ourselves spending more time talking about Trump all over again. And I understand my left's infatuation and the Trump deranged syndrome, which overwhelms them, and I do hope that through NIH or others they can seek help. The whole point is that this was a conditions-based agreement. It was very clear from the beginning that if the conditions were not met, and as you said, General Sadat, that there was a plan B, an alternative mechanism. The other thing that our colleagues continue to fail to acknowledge is that President Trump, towards the end of his presidency, had actually reversed his decision at the advisory of the generals and was going to maintain troops there to continue its support. We fail to always mention that piece of things. And it's funny to me that Biden, and Mr. Roggio, you said it so perfectly just now, I couldn't have said it better. He was so willing to do what was necessary to make sure that the fall of Somalia did not occur with the government there. He was so quick to go ahead and withdraw the Remain in Mexico agreement, but for some reason, that Doha agreement, he couldn't make any changes to whatsoever. It was absolutely mandatory. No one could change anything, even though he's the elected president. That wasn't a complete possibility. Can't understand that, but that's something else. The other thing is that I do agree with my colleague. There were many missteps in playing political football through multiple administrations and their understanding of what we're supposed to be doing and what the mission was to achieve. We were not originally there, as we all remember in 2001, to think about nation building. We were there for an actual counterterrorism operation, which was to go in and stop Afghanistan from being a safe haven of terror and to withdraw. What did we leave? We left the Haqqani network, ISIS Khorasan, the Taliban, billions of dollars in equipment, and stronger now than they were before, and actually closer, I would argue, to achieving the goal of what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was trying to achieve with a caliphate and a singular ISIS cohesion, which is what we've left them, a full country to now terrorize, exploit, and to utilize. He's right that there was over 10 Congresses who had gotten this wrong, which is why I ran for Congress. One of the main reasons was to try and come in here to prevent what we've continued to see. Because the majority of Congress, by the way, only 17% were actual military veterans. And we wonder why we get it wrong. You know, in my military and government service, I spent over 7 years of my life in Iraq, over 3 years in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia. I know a thing or two about poor decision-making. And I'll go ahead and say this. It was not the fault of the boots on the ground who was carrying out their objectives, missions. It was the suits in D.C. who was ruining the entire thing. But we need to understand something. What we're looking into is not just the fall of Afghanistan, but also, and again, accountability for what is already being forgotten, and it is shameful, shameful, that we're already forgetting our 13 heroes who had fallen at Abbey Gate. You know, our State Department sat in here talking about how they were there on the ground helping to find solutions, and they were with the troops day and night when those gates were available to help Americans and others to be able to get out. But my question still remains to the State Department, if you were there day and night with our military service veterans at those gates, then why do we have 13 fallen service members and not a single State Department member who had fallen with them? That doesn't tell me that you were at the gates when it was necessary. Mr. Roggio, I got a question for you, sir. Prior to the U.S. full withdrawal from Afghanistan, you looked at publicly available information and warned that Afghanistan was likely to fall to the Taliban by the end of summer of 2021, which is exactly what we saw happen. Same thing that we warned about, because we knew that NPRI and others, and again, I think it's a different hearing, but we should be actually setting up a subcommittee that reviews the subcontractors who is more worried about supplying information that basically showed them in a positive light so they could win more contracts and follow-ups, as opposed to the ground reality where they were evaluating the willingness to fight, the necessary equipment, and the strategy on the ground. But having said that, from your perspective, was the problem with the conflicting or incomplete intelligence, the leaders, or was it both?
Sir, I think a mix of both in my experience. I created the map that we all saw on television over the summer of 2001, where I assessed the security in the districts. I started that, I think, in 2014 because I was testing the Taliban's counter strategy to ours. The Taliban said, fine, you want to protect the cities and key districts, we'll go in the rural districts and we'll meet you in the cities. And I began gathering data, and over time it became very clear to me that the Taliban had a strategy and it was implementing it. The problem, I think, was I can't just blame the suits, sir. I think that part of our military leadership and the top level leadership within the intelligence community is also responsible for this, and they need to be held to account. We were given very rosy assessments that I could easily disprove, and journalists and other experts who covered, for instance, there were times where the U.S. estimate that was released by SIGAR would say, like, the province of Kunduz, which I can't remember, I think it has 7 districts. The SIGAR would say something like, oh, only 1 or 2 are Taliban controlled and 1 or 2 contested. Everyone who followed Afghanistan closely would know that just about all the districts were contested, and the Taliban controlled at least 2 districts at a time. So this is what I saw, and some of this was because generals didn't want this stuck on their performance view. Some of this was political because, you know, look, you had General Miller stand up and say, after he canceled SIGAR's reporting of the data on the districts, he stood up and said, well, it doesn't matter. Security in the districts doesn't matter. What matters is negotiations with the Taliban. The top level of the U.S. military was infected by this political solution, this negotiated solution, and that has significant effects. People that I have spoken to during this, that were in the military, intelligence services, people that worked, that did the hard work, they understood what was happening in Afghanistan. But as the information made it up the chain of command, it was softened and softened. And why did we need to have, for instance, statements like, there's only 50 to 100 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan, or the Taliban ties to al-Qaeda are weak or non-existent, because ultimately 3 presidents wanted to leave Afghanistan. President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all wanted to leave. And in order to do so, there could not be significant ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda could not have a significant presence. Look, that's another thing that I tracked here. They would tell us 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda were in Afghanistan, and yet we would kill anywhere from 25 to 75 Al-Qaeda that were operating. This is from U.S. military's own press releases that I would track. So did Al-Qaeda have this sort of steady state where they kept it at 50 to 100, with this estimate stayed the same? It only went away when we conducted a raid on a terrorist training, or 2 Al-Qaeda training camps in Kandahar in October 2015, I believe it was, and they killed almost 200 Al-Qaeda fighters. So, you know, I apologize for telling a long story here, but there was significant problems within the military. I'm talking the higher level leadership within the military, within the intelligence community, and with our political leadership. And I do hope that a committee is set up to get to the bottom of these key issues, because, you know, if what happened in Afghanistan stayed in Afghanistan, oh, well, fine, we lost a brush war. Sorry, my Afghan friends who are friends. And I obviously am being sarcastic there, because we should maintain commitments to our allies, but it doesn't. What happens if we're getting it wrong in Ukraine? What happens if we're getting it wrong with Taiwan and China? You know, these are the questions that we need to ask.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing the witness to go ahead and fully answer this. I agree we have a counting issue. We didn't know how many Americans were left in Afghanistan. When they said 300, 3,000, 30,000, didn't know. We continue to get this wrong, and that's why we shouldn't engage in warfare unless we're willing to see it through, get back to an America First agenda, and make sure that we're doing this right so we don't repeat Afghanistan again. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. I now recognize Ms. Sherfless McCormick.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to say thank you so much for all of our members and who served in Afghanistan. Thank you for your service, and for everyone who's testifying, thank you so much for your service. I have a few questions for you, but first I wanted to start off that the point of this hearing is for us not to be blame shifting, but really to identify and isolate what are the instances that happen, and so we can look for accountability points. And so with that, I kind of want to stay away from the rhetoric about Trump and who's infatuated with it, but really look into the cumulative effects of the leadership and what led to Afghanistan. So I just want to find some facts here. I want to start off with a question for Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Dr. Mukhopadhyay, we already discussed that at the time of the withdrawal, there were only 2,500, and we saw that Mr. Roggio already admitted that that wasn't a number that could have been sustainable towards winning. But I wanted to hear from you about that. Do you think that we could have sustained that presence in Afghanistan with only 2,500?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I think it's important to understand the 2,500 number in context, right? I want to underscore something that General Sadat said, which I think is very powerful. He said, after the Doha Agreement, quote, politically we could never recover, unquote. So I think for me, we have to understand, how did we get to 2,500 when we had double, 5-digit number, right?
A clarification, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but who signed us into the Doha Agreement?
President Trump signed the Doha Agreement. So that was an agreement that was negotiated without the Afghan government at the table. It was an agreement that basically satisfied the minimum American demand and the maximum Taliban demand, and secured a promise of American withdrawal on an established timeline, right? And what that, I think, did was signal, we can talk about the military consequences of having troops on the ground or not, but I think the political consequences are central, and that's why I underscored General Sadat's comment. To signal a drop to zero.
I wanted to refocus us back to the number of troops, because
Sure.
we're going to have more questions, but the sustainability of 2,500 troops, what is it going to be sustainable to stay there and actually assist the Afghans?
No, I don't think so.
And so my next question is for anyone who would like to answer it. Now, it seems like both administrations had the goal to withdraw all the troops. Would we agree to that?
Yes.
And so with both administrations having that goal, is there a reason that you believe they would both articulate this clear goal at the time?
My understanding is that both administrations felt that the longest American war needed to come to an end. I think that the speed with which the Trump administration moved forward and signaled both to the Taliban and the Afghan government that Americans would withdraw no matter what began a cascade of events that at that point, the outcome for the Republic was sealed from that point onward.
And could you, this question's for anybody who wants to answer it, could you describe in detail how you believe the Taliban would respond if the U.S. did not pull out?
We don't know the answer to that question. We certainly never got an opportunity to find out. To the point of could 2,500 troops have secured or have aided the Afghan security forces? I could tell you on April 13th, 2021, they were aiding.
So how could you say with substantial certainty that if we had stayed in, we would have actually won and helped that?
I certainly can't say with certainty, Congresswoman. But what I can say with certainty is that the withdrawal order directly led to the collapse of the Afghan government and military.
And that order was a derivative of the Doha Agreement, correct?
Ultimately, look, President Trump could have pulled all of the troops out of Afghanistan by the day that he left office. He did not. Mm-hmm. President Biden had the opportunity to adjust course. Mm-hmm. Again, he had a decision to make. Was it worth supporting the Afghan government or was it not? He chose that it wasn't. So look, I mean, I could blame the Bush administration. I could blame there's 2 decades of blame to go around, but there was only one decision, only one order to withdraw, and that was issued on April 14th, 2021.
But that, I mean, when we say that, when you make that statement, it makes it seem as if that was independent of the agreement. And I'm looking for, because you said with substantial certainty that if we did not pull out, that the government would have been standing, but we already identified the terms of the agreement, the timeline where we had 3 administrations who were setting us down that road. In addition to that, we also have both of the administrations who were trying to pull out completely. So with us not identifying with a substantial certainty that 2,500 could have won and not being able to understand why did both administrations try to actually pull out or have that goal, I just don't feel comfortable that we have pinpointed what went wrong and how can we in the future make sure that this doesn't happen again. I don't know if you want to extend any more time or if anybody can help us find those facts to identify what went wrong so we can preclude them in the future.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, and I'd like to give my fellows an opportunity to speak. You know, I can't build a time machine and change the withdrawal order and find out. I wish I could, but I certainly cannot. But, you know, I just maintain that the Trump agreement, there was no bigger critic of it than myself. It was a bad deal, and it's one that should have been recognized. President Biden himself called it a bad deal, and yet he executed that. Why are we not asking that question? And with that.
Ma'am, I think there is a point that we all need to understand. Oftentimes, we see the U.S. politicians do not understand the capability of their own military. 2,500 U.S. trigger pullers was more than enough to support this. And ask me this because the nature of the U.S. operation has completely changed. In 2019, when I was commander of JSOC, we partnered with General Chris Donahoe, one of the best warriors that America has. And by the end of the year, we retook 12 districts, destroyed 4 Taliban customs, which was the main income of the Taliban, and we have destroyed 34% of the Taliban combat power with a new room built, which we called it CSAR, Combined Situational Awareness Room. The United States military has a lot of technology, very sophisticated. If you allow them politically to use it, to pull the trigger. And also, please remember, there was the Afghan forces as well. Your troops ended combat operations in 2016. It was the Afghans that were fighting. We were protecting American bases. 2021, Congressman Waltz was in Kandahar, and it was Afghans. And please know that that even though when the Taliban wanted to attack the American troops, there was no way they could pass the Afghan side of it. So it was pointless if they went on a killing spree. Believe me, if they could kill an American infidel, they would. It was just they didn't have the access, but they sold this so expensively on the American side that we're no longer going to attack attack your troops. The point on President Trump, we also felt that he recoursed his decision. And I was, told that he wants to keep Bagram, he wants to keep Kandahar. I don't want to get into this blame game, but what is happening today is as a result of the United States leaving Afghanistan, we lost a country. And believe me, you lost reputation. You have less access in the world today. You have less capabilities on counterterrorism in the world. You have less strategic maneuverability in Southeast Asia, and you have less competitive advantage by not having an allied government inside Afghanistan. Even we would have been able to sustain with 2,500 if we got continuous...
So you can say, thank you so much for your giving us this time, but you can say with substantial certainty that 2,500 would have been enough, even though the other two don't believe so.
Yes, ma'am. It was enough before they came out, so it would have been enough.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
You're welcome. And I'll just say, I said this once, I'll say it again. I think it's important to define terms, and as Americans, we define terms as win or loss for America. And I define that specifically with a win is the way we execute this, we end up with outcomes that are better than what we anticipated. A loss is we end up with outcomes that are worse than what we anticipated. And what happened with the way the Biden administration did this ended up with outcomes that were immeasurably worse than what was anticipated. And that's how I define win and loss for America. I now recognize my friend, my colleague, Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I continue to be astounded at these hearings on the focus on the Doha Agreement, as though it was absolute and irreversible when the Biden administration on day one reversed the Keystone XL, has reversed border policy, has reversed Iranian maximum pressure, has reversed, tried to re-enter the Iran deal, the Paris Accords. I mean, we could go down a long list of reversals of this administration from the last that it had no issue doing, but suddenly we're to believe they were handcuffed. So let's go to the capabilities issue. A lot of focus and discussion on the 2,500 that President Trump left in place along with our only air base in the world, sandwiched between Russia, China, and Iran, but it ignores the conversation on the tens of thousands of contractors that kept the Afghan Air Force flying. President Ghani's last request as president of Afghanistan was for President Biden to please at least allow the contractors to stay so that the Afghan Air Force could continue the fight. It ignores our intelligence professionals that had been plussed up. It ignores the 7,000 NATO troops that were there and had to be fully withdrawn. So I find this quite a convenient narrative. But here nor there, I think at the end of the day, while we deeply care about our commitment to the Afghans, and it is horrendous what is happening to our former allies, despite denials from the Deputy Secretary of State, said she has no evidence they're being hunted down. Really, the piece there is international terrorism, and Afghanistan once again becoming a platform for al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, General Sadat, you testify there are thousands of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, training in Afghanistan. Their leaders are moving freely in Afghanistan. The UN says 30 to 40 senior al-Qaeda leaders moving around freely in Afghanistan with several hundred fighters. Yet we have President Biden, who just on June 30th of this year said, remember what I said about Afghanistan? I said al-Qaeda's not there. I was right, patting himself on the back in front of a group of reporters. So, General Sadat, can you speak to al-Qaeda's presence, one, and then two, this narrative that, don't worry, al-Qaeda isn't suddenly the not-so-bad terrorists working with the not-so-bad Taliban against the really bad ISIS, which I think is conflating local conflicts with, I don't believe for a second the Taliban will stop al-Qaeda or ISIS from once again attacking Western interests, which is their absolute goal. But can you speak to that?
Thank you. Congressman, there is al-Qaeda leaders. Osama bin Laden's oldest son, Abdullah bin Laden, he is in Kandahar. He meets often with Haibatullah, the supreme leader of Taliban. In fact, he's advising them on Middle East and foreign donations collection from the Muslim countries. He's married to a Kandahari woman from Arghandab district in Kandahar. Osama Mahmoud, also known as Abu Zar, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Indian subcontinent, is in Afghanistan. He lives there. Muhammad al-Ghamdi, Al-Qaeda's number 2, comes and travels to Afghanistan.
So just in the, excuse me, General, just in the time I have remaining, they fully intend to rebuild and reconstitute their ability to attack the West.
I can tell you with certainty that some of the things you see in the Middle East, they have been trained in
We also have UN reporting that Siraj Haqqani, the Taliban's Minister of the Interior, are issuing passports with a functioning international airport to fly al-Qaeda, now with official documents, all over the world. Does anyone dispute that on this panel? Does they dispute the UN's reporting on this?
We agree some al-Qaeda leaders were given passports in order to travel and meet with their Middle Eastern allies and branches.
Can we just switch very quickly? Can we talk about Bagram and that critical 12,000-foot runway that was closer to the Chinese border than Mexico City is to the border with Texas? Who's sitting at Bagram now?
It's the Taliban, Congressman.
And is there a Chinese presence? Can you speak to the Chinese presence now? And
China wants to take Bagram Air Base as a commercial hub. But we know that they could turn it into a military airbase.
for what commercial reason? Would it be the, I don't know, the world's 3rd largest known lithium supply, 5th largest known copper, chromite? I mean, a whole slew of rare earths and minerals that we're dependent upon in our economy?
That's correct. China has contracts amounting to $20 billion with the Taliban today. And they are intending to use the Afghan mines, lithium, copper, gas and oil, and others. China is also bribing the Taliban to allow to build a road from China to Iran because China has a 25 years oil deal with Iran, so they can travel through Afghanistan if the U.S. Navy blocks China in the Indian Ocean.
General, my time's expired, but General, I commend you for standing strong, and I commend people, that brave Afghans that continue to resist this oppression. And I will continue to press the administration on what happens if this deal with the devil that they've made with the Taliban goes wrong and America is once again attacked. Because we will need local allies, as we did when we had to go back into Iraq after Obama pulled us out, to continue this fight against extremism that the entire world is now seeing tragically on full display. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz. I spoke in my opening statement about the failure of this administration to recognize reality, to live in reality. I'm going to focus my questions on that. And whether it's domestic or foreign policy, they don't look at reality. They look at what they think is political reality, whether it's with the southern border and saying it's secure, whether it's with saying that inflation is just this transitory thing, whether it's what was taking place with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Security Council or the President or the press secretary speaking about what was taking place, or right up into this moment suggesting that there's somehow combat effectiveness in having a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. There's a failure to live in the reality of the situation and the reality of the situation for the betterment of the United States of America. I, in my statements, said, I think that April 14th date of go to zero was the oh shit moment. Like, people at that moment said, wow, I'm going to have to get out of Dodge. I'm going to have to hide my family. I'm going to have to find a route out of here. I'm going to have to find documentation to, figure out how I can get into some other nation. I'm going to be hunted. I don't know if I'm going to be able to stay in my home. We don't know how many people are going to be requesting to get out of Afghanistan, and when you multiply wives and children, from 8 to 28, the list goes on and on. I considered that to be an oh shit moment. But that's me. I want to know from you all, when did you identify an oh shit moment in that year as we were approaching the withdrawal of Afghanistan, or Ms. Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Mukhopadhyay? It doesn't have to be that year. I know you've spoke about 20 years, but when did you identify an oh shit moment for that? And like I said, for myself, I capture it in, there are ways to define win versus loss. And it was in that time that I realized we were going to move towards a loss, and this was going to be significantly worse than what they're anticipating. So in that, I'll leave it to you all to sort out the order in which you choose to answer this. But that's what I'd like to know from each of you, is when do you identify it as that?
Thank you, Chairman. I want to start by saying that I do remember that announcement, that moment in April 2021, and I do remember feeling very nervous. And I will also just say that August 2021, September, right to the present moment, for me, for all of us who cared about and worked on Afghanistan, has been a deeply challenging time, and a time for us to reckon with all of our responsibilities on that front. I would go back, I suppose, to February 2020 as the moment when I considered the beginning of the end of the war. I think that was the moment when a deal was signed between the United States and the insurgency it had been fighting, without our partner, the Afghan government, at the table, unambiguously subordinating the possibility for peace in Afghanistan to our exit and to the demands of the Taliban. And so for me, that's the moment.
I'll say the moment was April 14th, 2021. That was the moment when everyone got off the fence, and the Afghans got off the fence, and they had to make decisions. At a local level, Taliban commanders would go to district leaders or military bases, issue an ultimatum: fight, surrender, or just walk away. Some fought, some surrendered, some walked away. This, to me, there was still a U.S. presence. There was still hope that on April 13th, there was still a U.S. presence in Afghanistan. There was still hope that the decision to stay, that the problems could be fixed. Look, I spoke to numerous officials within the Afghan government, within Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and both over the span of a year, from the date of the Doha Agreement being signed, even after the withdrawal was announced, many, if not all, there would be diplomats or an advisor to the president, and people of that nature. They were not convinced that the U.S. was going to leave up until August 14th, 2021. That's when they knew the U.S. was leaving. That's when it all became a reality to them, and that's when Afghanistan began to fully unravel.
Mr. Chairman, I think I agree with you. The bad moment was when the announcement came in. But for me, I was blindfolded with my brotherhood and friendship with the U.S. military. I could never believe that when things go wrong, so wrong, the Americans will leave us and the U.S. troops will not help me, will not help General Khoshal or Governor Massoud, because we spent 20 years building relationships. We became brothers. For real, and we would never think that, the Taliban will be advancing on our cities and the American B-52 will come and film them and just go away. Mr. Chairman, there is horrendous events that the U.S. Air Force had filmed in the last months of the war, that the Taliban were committing war crimes. They were not authorized to conduct airstrikes against them. I think there's three distinct things that needs to be recognized. The first thing is end of combat operation in Afghanistan. That had already happened. The second thing was end of prisons in Afghanistan, which President Biden tried to achieve. And the last thing, which is important for us, is more than everything, is the end of our republic. I think these three things have its own definitions. We as soldiers fight wars and make peace for a reason. If the reason is not achieved, we will continue to fight. If the reason is achieved, why is everyone saying that, oh, this war needed to end? Okay, it ended in our loss, in your loss as well. We lost the war, and we were fighting. The Afghans were bleeding for this war, and we just figured out how to win it. The new general officers from a younger generation of Afghan leaders, we grew up in the last 20 years, went to school with Americans, Brits, NATO countries. We just became general officers. General Sadat is sitting here, one of our best special forces commanders. He became a general officer in 2018. I became a general officer in 2019. Governor Masood is sitting here, is a young Afghan politician from Farah province. He became a governor in 2021. Just that the U.S. real partners took over the responsibility that we knew how to fight, how to win, how to strategize, and how to combine the Afghan mindset and psyche with the U.S. technology and strategy. We all spoke the same language, we communicated, and this was the moment when the plug was pulled. It's just this, a couple of more, like 2-3 more years working together with the Afghans as the new generation took over the other generations, we would have won. And you've been in Afghanistan, Congressman Crow was in Afghanistan, and some others. You can speak to this. The Afghan Special Forces were one of the best special forces in that region. We operated in a dynamic and an environment that I would say less special forces in the world could actually take on that. So I'm telling you, it was not the lack of sacrifices on our side. It was not lack of capabilities. It was a political failure that came from Washington, and of course we are blamed for this. We have our own responsibilities. We have our own political failures back at home from our own politicians. But what about now? Terrorism is real. Al-Qaeda is real. If you tell me the United States mainland is safe, I will tell you it's not, sir. Okay, the Al-Qaeda may not be able to pull out another 9/11 attack today, but they will be able to do it tomorrow. And the United States is not exactly a country that's concised within its own borders. You are a global superpower. You project power across the country. You have bases, embassies, trade routes, envoys, and citizens traveling across the world. Are you telling me that those citizens are less important than your mainland here? Are they not vulnerable in Africa? Are they not vulnerable in Middle East? Can they travel to South Central Asia in the next 1 year? Nobody can give me that assessment. So what I'm suggesting here is a way forward for us. We are ready to partner again. We're ready for the great sacrifice. This is why we set up Afghanistan United Front. Young generals, young politicians, Afghan soldiers, civil society members to come together and craft a future for Afghanistan to free ourselves from this religious tyranny, from this terrorism. We don't like Al-Qaeda to be our guests. We refuse to accept that. And we need a little bit of help from your side. We need political support because we don't have a government. And remember, when 9/11 happened, you guys came to us. We helped you. We went to war not only against Al-Qaeda, but we went to war against every single individual, every single country that was at war with the United States. I'm not saying it didn't benefit us. It benefited us greatly. We built a complete new country, and we're grateful and thank you. But the time didn't end. The world has become so small that anybody can travel from any part of the world and do things in another part of the world. So that said, if you allow Al-Qaeda and Taliban and other extreme organizations to grow in capabilities, to start completing their trainings, they will come back and attack you. If Al-Qaeda starts attacking 10 countries, 12 countries simultaneously in Middle East and Africa and Europe, can the United States respond to that? I'm suggesting we go back to the root of the problem. We start a new partnership, Mr. Chairman. We are ready for it.
Thank you for your reflection, General. Thank you all for your answers. I now recognize my friend, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to call you a friend, brother. Thank you for what you did for our country and what you continue to do. Before I give my questions, I just want everybody to know that Staff Sergeant Ryan Knaus was the last person who died in Afghanistan, and he was a constituent of mine. His family are dear friends of mine, and They named I live on a state highway, and they named that, at my suggestion, they named that road after him. So I'm reminded of his sacrifice and the sacrifice y'all and your people have made. So thank y'all so much. I'm wondering, and you can just answer these briefly because I've got quite a few questions. General Sadat, what was the fighting like with the Taliban before President Biden's go-to zero order, and what was it like after?
Sir, on the 31st of April, the last of American troops left from Helmand. On the 1st of May, the attacks in Helmand has decreased by 380%. This was like influx of hundreds and hundreds of Taliban driving from Iran and Pakistan. And the first provincial capital they wanted to capture was Helmand, where my command was. Unfortunately, Helmand is located just as a nod in front of Iran and Pakistan. In the 4 months that continued, the Taliban has lost 10,000 of their forces, but they couldn't take Lashkar-Gah. They conducted 17 suicide attacks only against myself when I was moving from one front line to another, but they couldn't take what they wanted to take. But the fighting was vicious. We lost a lot of people. Taliban lost a lot of people. It was very tough, very difficult. It was like in the movies. You can only see it in some of the World War II movies, except it was real.
Right. My father fought in the Second World War, so in the Pacific, so thank you. Were the women and girls allowed to go to school before President Biden withdrew from Afghanistan?
Yes, sir.
And I assume they're not now. That's correct. Is that correct? No? Okay. Mr. Roggio, is that how you pronounce that name?
Yes, sir.
Oh, got it right. How many articles or studies did the Foundation for Defense of Democracies publish about the Taliban possibly taking over before it happened?
I couldn't count, sir. We published numerous studies on, I honestly, sir, I just, this
So you
was
weren't
something-
surprised?
Yeah, no, I wasn't surprised. This is something we warned about.
Right. Were you
beginning in
surprised at
2000.
how fast they did take over?
No, sir.
Okay. Why does this administration continue to say they were surprised by how quickly the Taliban regained control? I mean, everybody was talking about it. Everybody said it was going to happen. It was on the news. It just seemed to me, that with them to say that, to me, was just ridiculous.
It would be an admission that if they knew that Afghanistan would have collapsed so quickly, then, and they withdrew anyway, it would have been an admission that they left Afghanistan to the predations of the Taliban.
Okay. Why does this administration continue to say, though? Why would they say they're surprised? I mean, they just have to admit they were wrong. I mean, it's kind of like our southern border. They can't admit we got a problem with fentanyl because they'd have to admit it's coming over the southern border. I mean, it's the same type of deal. It's kind of a diversion, in my opinion. It just seems to me, you made a mistake, let's move on. Take your lumps and go.
Yeah, I think this administration, look, either it understands that Afghanistan was going to collapse or it didn't know. Neither is good. So it's maintained the quick collapse narrative in order to not, this administration doesn't want to reflect on its failure in issuing the order to withdraw from Afghanistan. Even the State Department report that was issued, I want to say a month or two ago, the primary blame was placed on President Trump. And as I've said numerous times, that Doha deal was a mistake, but it was a mistake that could be corrected. The withdrawal could not. The administration clearly hoped that it would gain some type of Vietnam-esque decent interval, withdraw from Afghanistan. Maybe it collapses in a year or two and they could point the finger at the Afghan government.
I'm running out of time real quick. If the evacuation were properly planned, would the attack at Abbey Gate have occurred?
No, that would have been an extremely difficult attack to have been carried out at Bagram. Anyone who's been to Kabul, which I have, and of course my panelists has as well, it knows that conducting an evacuation from Hamid Karzai International Airport would have resulted in an absolute disaster. A private in the U.S. Army would have understood this, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. You should know while I pinpoint us on starting on time, I have a laissez-faire approach to stopping the clock for individuals. If you're saying something valuable, we want to hear it. So now I recognize my friend, Mr. Crow, again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Mukhopadhyay, I would like to go back to you. You earlier were trying to provide some additional context around the issue of the drawdown and the troop number. And I would love to hear you finish that line of thinking, because I think the context around that and what was going on politically and within Afghanistan and the months and years leading up to that is very important here.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, actually, in 2019, I wrote a piece for Lawfare in which I talked about, as the debate was happening around what the troop numbers should be, and it was very contentious, as you'll no doubt recall, I was of the view, as General Sadat explained, that Afghan forces were doing the bulk of the fighting. So really what was significant about our troop presence, in addition to all of the support that contractors provided, was the political import of the troop presence. Because the political import, for me, was a signal on the part of the Americans to Afghan elites, to soldiers and citizens, and to the Taliban, and to the neighbors, that the U.S. government had confidence in and an investment in the Republic. And so the question of how to end the war, I think we all know that Republicans and Democrats agreed the war needed to come to an end. The question was how to do that responsibly. And the reason that I keep coming back to the Doha Agreement, but really it's not just the Doha Agreement, right? It's starting with the negotiations that began by President Trump in 2018, was that set of negotiations signaled to the Afghan government, to the Taliban, to the Afghan people, that in fact the US government no longer had confidence in and an investment in the Republic. And I think it's important to say, when we keep zeroing in on April 2021, that as Mr. Roggio's own data shows, that only 129 of the 407 districts in Afghanistan at that time were fully controlled by the government, right? This was a process of the Taliban recognizing that it was winning, and the Afghan government being in a position to never be quite clear, to be able to predict what is going to happen, because President Trump raised the number of troops, then dropped the number of troops, then changed his mind, then signed the agreement, then dropped the number below what the commitment actually was to the Taliban. And I can tell you that even after the April 21 announcement, I was in Kabul in June 21, and it was very clear to me that senior members of the Afghan government did not believe that the Americans were going to leave. And I don't think that we can attribute that to President Biden's decision. It was a much longer pattern of feeling a sense simultaneously, on the one hand, as General Sadat said, that we would never abandon them, and on the other hand, a sense that at any moment we might abandon them. And that unpredictability was most acute in the Trump period. And there's plenty of blame to go across, as I said in my opening comments, across all four administrations. But that kind of unpredictability around troop numbers created a sort of political instability in Afghanistan that I don't think, that was a domino effect after February 2020 that I don't think we could have reversed.
Thank you for that. General Sadat, to you for a moment. This is not a trick question. I have no idea the answer to it. I'm really curious your thought on this. Is there an amount of time that after 20 years, more than 20 years, well, about 20 years, that the U.S. could have kept troops there, but then the Afghan forces could have stood on their own, and then we could have gone to zero? Do you have that number in your head? Because, I mean, we had been talking, we tried all the different levels, Mr. Roggio said, all the different levels, all the different surge strategies, all different tactics, I mean, we tried so many different things. I'm just wondering if there's an amount of time in your head that if you had just had, you know, X more years, that the outcome would have been different.
It wouldn't have been about the years, it was about the approach. I think, to be honest, we have to go back a little bit on negotiations. Negotiations with Taliban started in 2011 when they opened an official office in Doha. It was during President Obama, pulling out 5 detainees out of the prison, and the next day giving them a political stature globally. I think if that didn't begin, the Americans negotiated with Afghan government directly about your leaving, our country wouldn't have collapsed. In case that we continue to receive the amount of support in terms of military and combat from the U.S. I think what killed us, sir, that we could never recover was the fact that the U.S. government went behind our back and spoke to our enemy, made a deal with our enemy, making us look like we're the outsiders, and the real deal is with the Taliban. I think without the United States government talking to the Taliban, the Afghan government would have absolutely not only sustained, but we would actually succeed because of the reasons I just mentioned. The younger generation of Afghans, you fought and worked with Afghan military. Now, we raised through the ranks. And 20 years was the time we grew up in politics and military. I have a young colonel here, Colonel Parwani. He's not even 30 years old, but he was leading vicious wars in Kunduz, in Kandahar, and in Helmand. So they became more sophisticated, more capable. I believe it would have been, look, Afghanistan became a political toy a little bit. When President Bush was in charge, that was the best chance for Afghanistan. We appreciate, we honor President Bush. He listened to Afghans. He worked with the Afghans. When President Obama came, President Obama and President Karzai had bad relationship between each other, so it affected us. Then President Biden, back then Vice President, came and fought with our president, and their relationship became strained. It further affected us. I sometimes feel like President Biden has a vendetta against Afghans. The way he comments on us, the way he treats Afghans. And on the other couple of months ago, he wanted to give our money to 9/11 victims. And some of these things, look, we are a nation. We're a great nation. Our people are very proud people. We are the most loyal people that you can find if you become our allies. If you become our enemies, we will fight to our death. We're not just going to disappear tomorrow. We will rise again. We will get rid of the Taliban. And we hope that we can do it together with you. And it will be good for you to have a friend, to have an ally in that part of the world. We will take care of your interests as well, as long as you gave us some support. Things have happened, awful things, bad things, but I'm asking humbly this Congress, please, let's focus on what we can do together in the future.
Thank you, General.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple more questions myself now, and circled around the go to zero order. Mr. Roggio, can you discuss that in relationship to Taliban advancements?
Yes. So by by April of 2021, just again, I want to be clear that the map I created is an assessment, and you could flip some of these numbers either ways, but it painted a picture, by the way, that was very close to what the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction posed. There's differences between our methods and when their data was released, and my data was real time. Their data was always 90 days old, so it was always difficult to compare, but it was always 5 to 15% in together. Anyway, somewhere, the Afghan government, the Taliban controlled about 70 districts. The Afghan government, I believe you gave the number. I don't have them off the top of my head, but it's somewhere around 120 or so. And the rest were contested. That meant that the Afghan military was battling the Taliban for control of these districts. That number stayed pretty steady from 2020 to 2021, give or take. And as General Sadat noted, there was a significant, when President Trump when he restructured his Afghanistan policy, The Taliban actually lost control of districts, and the Afghans, they lost control of about 25 districts. So they were at their low peak. The numbers were in the 50s of the districts they controlled. The number of contested districts actually went down as well. So, and as General Sadat noted, the Afghan military was conducting primary security responsibilities. By the end of May, middle of June, the Taliban doubled the number of their districts that they controlled. It was clear that they were waiting for this moment for the U.S. withdrawal in order to launch its offensive. As General Sadat noted, fighters were flowing from Iran and Pakistan into Helmand, into
Let me
Kandahar.
pause. It was clear to you.
Yes, sir.
It was clear to me. Let me just ask that pointedly. Was it clear to you, General Sadat?
Sir, I was blindfolded again. I didn't believe that this day will happen. Maybe I was in full denial. It was my country. It was clear towards the end because every day I was waiting for my own death as I was fighting in the front line. So, yes, when, you know, we didn't get support. I got B-52 a couple of times, you know, chaired up. Then it didn't support me. It didn't drop bombs. So, yeah, we were doomed.
Congressman, if I just may add one thing, the U.S. military, by the middle of June, their numbers of the districts that they were saying were controlled by the Taliban were half the numbers that I was reporting, and then within 2 weeks, their numbers matched mine.
Why do you think that was?
Because the U.S. military was telling us that the withdrawal was being conducted in an orderly fashion, and the Afghan military, or I'm sorry, the Afghan government was not in danger of collapse. Admitting such a rapid degradation in the security in the districts in Afghanistan would have been an admission that that policy was failing. And the administration, again, wanted to leave Afghanistan. It was not going to change its policy, even though the facts on the ground were showing that the security situation was deteriorating.
Is there anybody specific that you attribute to telling you that?
Oh, it was General Milley himself said it on television.
How do you, General Sadat, looking at what Mr. Roggio just said, what was being put out in the media here, what was being said by General Milley, what was being put out in intelligence, how did that rosy, we'll call it a rosy assessment, that's an understatement. It's an understatement to call it a rosy assessment. How did that affect your decision-making on the ground? Did you buy into it? Did you not buy into it? You mentioned already that, you know, it gave you some blinders to some extent, your relationships, but can you help elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sir, the truth of the matter is after President Biden announced withdrawal, the U.S. forces and Afghan forces were in complete disarray with each other. Everybody was trying. The U.S. forces were ordered to leave. The Afghan forces we were trying to hold with our teeth, with our hands, whatever we could have got. So no, nothing really mattered to me anymore. Whatever Washington was saying, I was trying very hard with my brothers to save our country. The truth of the matter is, it was excruciating to separate two war brothers, two militaries that worked for 20 years. Suddenly, we were told not to work anymore.
You're saying what Washington was saying. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here. I'm trying to understand what you're saying. What Washington was saying didn't matter to you at all on the ground there because
I didn't trust them.
Garbage. It was crap.
I don't want to jump into I have a lot of respect for the U.S. military, for the veterans. I have worked with the CIA as a counterterrorism task force commander with the U.S. military for several years. But it seems as if when it came to Afghanistan during President Biden, a lot of the decisions made in the U.S. military and in the CIA were very, very politically driven. Sometimes they told us that as we don't know about what President Biden is thinking and deciding, they didn't know as well. President Trump, of course, he had made mistakes. The Doha Agreement was a mistake, but he listened to his generals. He listened to the assessments. He sent us letters about how can we win, for example, what can we do, these things. But I think when it came to President Biden, the vendetta didn't really allow President Biden to see Afghanistan for what it is. Even today, as this administration's diplomats are going around the world and lobbying for Taliban, the fact that everyone is trying to push Afghanistan under the rug, sir, is going to hurt your national security. You're not recognizing the threat as it is.
I appreciate that, General. I now recognize my friend, Mr. Nunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you, Chairman Mast, for leading this very important after action. It's the only one that has really been done in the House here, despite nearly 2 years with an absentee administration evaluating its own failures. I've flown enough combat missions in both Afghanistan and Iraq to know what success looks like, including support to special operations Afghan forces on the ground in the area, as well as to know what failure looks like. In this case, the failure when the withdrawal from Kabul resulted in volunteer veterans, myself and many included through Task Force Argo, helping to evacuate 3,000 individuals. For those individuals in the audience who have been part of that incredible volunteer team, a salute to each of you. You have done more than our own federal government has done to help save Americans in that horrible situation. I want you to know that in every mission that we flew, when we landed, we immediately did a post-flight report. That's the critical after action that really drives so that we can prevent failure in the future and advance successes that can be replicated. Your testimony today does so in a way that the rest of the administration has refused to acknowledge. Sadly, 13 Americans gave their lives in the evacuation, including Corporal Deacon Page from my own district in Red Oak, Iowa, who manned the line despite intelligence being very clear that there was a threat in the area, sacrificing so that other Americans and Afghan allies could evacuate. The honor and bravery of these American soldiers will never be forgotten. Their sacrifice in the theater of combat forever reminds us that our freedom is not free. And as geopolitical tensions across the globe continue to rise, the U.S. military must be prepared for future events that could have been learned years ago from our withdrawal from Afghanistan. So we're going to go Air Force style, and I'm going to do gunship questions here. That's meant to be the ability for us to get back and forth very quickly here. Lieutenant General Sadat, now you led special forces in Afghanistan. In fact, you're still on a hit list by the Taliban in country today for the service that you rendered in the defense of Americans and your country. I want to begin by first thanking you very much for all that you've done to help save the lives of our brothers and sisters in uniform, but also to your own country. Your service and sacrifice is not unnoticed. I'd begin with saying, did you find that the Biden administration communicated a plan for withdrawal to your team in a timely manner?
No, sir, there was no plan, sorry. A plan is when it's communicated to the partners on the ground. We were Afghans, we owned Afghanistan, we were in charge there. There was no plan shown to us.
As a result, were your special operators put at great risk?
They were at great risk, even...
Were Americans who depended on you to be the front line also put at great risk?
I think the confusion was real, and it put everybody at risk.
What was the impact of President Biden's go-to-zero order on assistance that the U.S. was providing to the Afghan military? Did it degrade your capabilities?
It immediately shut down all software system, including the aircraft software system for intelligence collection, navigation, and other matters.
I want to deep dive with you on that. As a recon airborne guy myself here, to the best of your knowledge, was close air support or armed overwatch or even overwatch of an intel asset provided during the evacuation of Kabul?
There were airplanes, but they didn't have the authority to pull the trigger.
Did you ever receive updates from them on what was happening real time on the ground?
No, sir.
What was the U.S. retrograde of Air Force cover in the immediate vicinity's impact to your team on the ground?
One day in June, I called the U.S. forces in Doha to give me support, and they said every day we can only send 3 drones to Afghanistan, and I said we used to have 20 drones, why not? They said the country of Oman is only allowing 3 drones per day. This is the time that across Afghanistan over 500 engagements are happening between Afghan and the Taliban forces. The U.S. could only get 3 drones to Afghanistan, and those were used to support the U.S. presence in Kabul, the embassy, and also the RS.
So, General, we've talked about how degraded your forces were, and as a result, how vulnerable both Americans and Afghans were. What did the Go to Zero order have on the Taliban at the same time?
It was celebration. They distributed sweets amongst each other, saying that the best has happened and we're going to take over the country. And it also gave them this, what do you say, this steroids. And therefore, a lot of them killed themselves, actually. It was unbelievable. What I saw was the zombies rushing in to take over districts and cities, although they died in hundreds.
And General, for your troops, for the forces you commanded, the abandonment by the Biden administration, what happened to the special operations forces that were left behind in Afghanistan?
Some were killed. Some 30,000 Afghan forces are in Taliban prisons. Some 10,000 special operators are in Iran that every day they're being arrested, tortured, and sent back to Afghanistan. The other day I got a call from Colonel Razik. He's one of the police officers who served under Khoshal in Pakistan. He lost one of his legs in Gereshk district of Helmand. The police took over his prosthetic leg and had him crawl for 30 feet into reaching the car. He called me back and he said, "Sir, what do you want me to do? Should I kill myself, go to Afghanistan, or go to Iran?" In Iran, our officers, general officers and colonels are working in floor mills. They're doing dirt jobs. They're working in street cleaning. Whatever money they earn, they have to give for visa. Iranian visa is very, very expensive. When their visas expired, they're being kicked back to Afghanistan, and the Taliban immediately arrest them, and then they disappear from the radar.
General, thank you very much for your service, for the service of the forces under you. It is never an advantage or a wish to have to lose our own forces at the hands of the enemy. It's even worse when we have to hand our own forces over to the enemy. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for leading on this, and I want to emphasize the fact here that after 2 decades of service by both American men and women and by your own countrymen, we leave behind a situation worse than where we found it, and we put on the altar of sacrifice the very men and women who stood up for a future of Afghan. Know that you have allies here. Thank you for the after action. I yield my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nunn. Mr. Crow, you're recognized for a closing statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all to the witnesses. This was a really important discussion, and thank you again to the folks in the audience for your service and sacrifice in a lot of different and very important ways. I wanted to just discuss for a moment something that General Sadat said, and you made a really important comment, General. And behind that comment was this idea that over 20 years, United States, had 100,000 troops there at one point. We tried many different strategies, many different approaches. I will ardently push back all the time on anybody that says that the Afghans were not willing to fight for their country. I mean, that is an absurd comment, and it's one that deserves to be called out whenever it's said, because I don't need to tell you all the heart, the grit, the sacrifice, how many of your brothers and sisters gave everything for your country. So it wasn't that. It wasn't the lack of a willingness of the Afghans to fight. So it really was this issue of politics. It really was this issue of the message that was being sent and the lack of an ability to have a viable political process that set the Afghan government up for success. And for me, the conclusion to that is that that whole problem happened way before April 2021. And again, my criticisms and critiques of the manner of the withdrawal are well documented, right? There were a lot of problems. I've been very clear about that, and we owe it to people to make sure we're correcting those, and that in the future, God forbid if we're ever in a situation of conducting a NEO of that magnitude again, that we fix it, and we do it better, and we do it differently. But the concrete had hardened so much by that point from a political perspective, that from the Taliban's point of view, it was very clear America was done. It was clear we were going to leave. At some point or another, it was clear probably years ago that that was going to happen, which put everybody in an untenable situation. I've learned to take people's word in this business, that a lot of times if you actually listen to them, they'll just tell you, right? So I wanted to go back to the former president. This is former President Trump at a rally in Ohio on June 26, 2021. This is what he said. I started the process. All the troops are coming back home. They couldn't stop the process. 21 years is enough, don't we think? 21 years. They couldn't stop the process. They wanted to, but it was very tough to stop the process. Message after message, time and again, it was clear to the Taliban the way this was going to go. I am sorry to all of you, to my Afghan brothers and sisters. You deserve better, and I am willing to talk with my colleagues here and to continue to talk with all of you about what we can do to keep the faith and to move forward, because there are things that we can do. This is a story that I don't believe is done. And we will continue to work with you on that. And one other call here, in addition to our policy with regard to Afghanistan, is we have obligations that we have not yet fulfilled to those who are still left behind, our partners and our brothers and sisters who are seeking refuge, who are hiding, who every day are fearing for their lives. We must pass the Afghan Allies Protection Act to expand the Special Immigrant Visa Program, to expand the P1 and P2 programs, to streamline that process, and to do everything possible to continue evacuations from Afghanistan to get people to safety. That is our obligation. And in addition to that, we must pass the Afghan Allies Adjustment Act to make sure that those who we have got out of Afghanistan have a clear path to start a new life in the United States, because they will be incredible citizens. They will be incredible parts of our community. I know it. They're my neighbors already in many respects, and we owe it to them. And so with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Like any event, the game ultimately ends. And throughout the game, there's mistakes that are usually made on both sides, but in the end, there is a winner and a loser. I defined winner and loser as the outcomes being better than expected or the outcomes being worse than expected, and that's how I give that definition, and I think it's quantifiable. This resulted in a loss. Outcomes worse than expected, immeasurably worse than expected, for not just what was the moment, certainly to this moment, and likely for at least a generation to come. And that happened because of abandonment and ignorance, ignoring reconnaissance, intelligence, surveillance at a basic level, just looking. And just to look, you had to willfully ignore what was taking place to get to the loss, the worst expectations, or the worst outcomes compared to what could have been expected. You had to willfully ignore what was taking place on the ground. And you had to abandon the people on the ground in order to reach what the administration wanted to reach, which is what they announced on the Go to Zero day, September 11 withdraw, political withdraw date, political celebration withdraw date. Let's reach a day that's an anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and make that our withdraw date, no matter what. No matter what, we're going to do this. Doesn't matter if we ignore how many special immigrant visas need to be issued, and if those people won't be able to get the documentation that they need because there's no Americans on the ground. Doesn't matter how many provinces are being taken over. Doesn't matter the Taliban advancement. Doesn't matter if we have to leave these air bases and retreat to another one. Doesn't matter if we have to call on an unnumbered amount of civilians not working for the State Department or the Department of Defense to come in and help get people out. Definitely not a part of any plan. Doesn't matter what has to happen. We're going to abandon, we're going to ignore in order to get to the political outcome that we desire. That resulted in a loss. Outcome worse than expectations. I thank you all for your testimony, your eyewitness accounts, your firsthand accounts, sharing your heart about how you felt about the situation at the time, rehashing that. It's of great value to each and every one of us on both sides of the aisle. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for each and every one of you. I hope that you'll respond to those in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit those statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations, and without objection, this committee stands adjourned. Thank you.